I'm Jeff Ramsdale.
Tyler C.
I'm a solutions architect at Dev9.
I'm a developer at Dev9.
Tyler works on my team. And we have been using very successfully Spring Boot, which is a relatively new project that we wanted to talk to you about. The first thing we want to do is find out what kind of background you have with Spring Boot so we know more about our audience and what level we need to talk at. We also want to find out some of your interests. So first off, can I find out who has used Spring Boot? Okay, good.
Does that include trying out the 5-line Groovy demo?
You know, that's actually good. That's a good start. Okay, so we can mention that. So
You are now the expert in the room.
Exactly. So who has used Spring? So about half maybe. Okay, good. And who among the Spring users has used Java config instead of XML? Okay, 1.5 maybe. Okay, so that's really good to know. That kind of sets our baseline on who we're talking to. And actually, thankfully, there's not too much diversity because there are so many different directions that we can go. This sets sort of the stage on starting at the very beginning. And we did call it an introduction. And I called it an introduction in code because you're looking at the only slide that I've prepared. From here on out, we're just going to look at code. But not a lot of code, as you'll find out.
Are you going to let us download some working examples, or do we have to type really fast to keep up?
The truth is it's mostly generated if you want it to be. And I'll show you that almost right off. And we'll do very little coding from there.
I've got a couple repos for the stuff that I'm going to present, and I can totally share that out via GitHub.
And the video will be online.
Oh, okay.
If there's demand and we come up with something by the end that we would like to post, we can certainly do that as well. So let's talk at the end and bring that up in the Q&A if we haven't addressed it by then. Meanwhile, we already have had a couple questions, so I was going to say feel free along the way to ask questions. Let me know if I'm going too deep, too fast, if I'm not hitting a topic that you want to touch on, because there's no specific agenda, and we're here to serve you. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to come up with our agenda. I have a friend at a previous employer, and this is how he liked to do every meeting. He said you shouldn't go into a meeting unless you have an agenda, and he would insist on everybody agreeing on the agenda from the very beginning and putting it on the whiteboard, and you check it off as you go down, and you know the meeting is over when you've checked off all of the things. So Tyler's going to collect some things to put on our agenda for the
Put the first thing on is Java config, because that seems very vital to what we're going to be doing tonight. Anybody else have any topics on the top of their head that they would like to kind of cover with this? Any ideas?
And I realize that it's early, so this is like wide open, you may not know. But if anything comes to mind that you'd like to touch on that you maybe heard of, let us know.
I don't know if it's appropriate, but I would love to have a working example of Spring, and why not Spring Boot? That's fine. That uses Hibernate for username, password, authentication, and authorization. Is that asking too much? And gives me a session cookie that I can use with Angular on.
That might be a little far. The first part, part A, we might be able to reach.
Okay.
But I might have pointers on the others. So let's talk.
Okay. I've been really wanting that for a long time.
Okay.
Cool.
Again, bring it up in the Q&A if we haven't addressed it at the end, and then I have some pointers that I can give on anything that we haven't necessarily covered. All right, anything else you want to make sure we cover? Otherwise, we'll just plow in. All right? So Spring Boot is a relatively new project at Spring Framework that they say it's an opinionated view of how Spring should be done. So Spring's been around a very long time. A lot of people use Spring. A lot of people associate Spring with XML syntax. And there are many good things that are going on in the Spring family of products, and I'm not a paid shill, but I do like their work. And I will tell you this, that I've always been sort of a Spring fan. Like, if you did a lot of things for me that I was really happy with, Spring Boot makes Spring really fun. It really makes Java development really fun and really simple to get started. And it ties together all these different projects in a way that is really a delightful experience. So if you've heard about things that have been going on in like Ruby on Rails and Node.js and other such projects in like, what are kind of traditionally considered to be like lighter weight frameworks than Java, they've informed a lot of the work that's gone into Spring Boot to make it much easier to spin up a new Java project and to do a lot of the things that you just need to do in every project that you do, like a configuration that varies by environment. That was a really simple one that was always kind of a pain to do in the Java world. And Spring Boot makes that really easy. So I'm going to start you right off at start.spring.io, which is a little code generator website that they provide to generate a Spring project for you. And you can go here and put in your, one thing I didn't ask about. How many people have Maven experience? Is there anybody who does not have Maven experience? Okay, a little iffy? Okay, because we're gonna hit on some Maven. So I might touch on some stuff that's just gonna go a little over, but it's sort of necessary for those who do want to know how some of the wiring works. So we'll get into that. So you have a group ID and an artifact ID. These will be part of your Maven artifact. The description, package name. So this is going to generate code. It needs a package to generate the code into. You can generate Gradle if you prefer it. I don't. You can generate a jar or a war. You can pick your Java version. 1.7 is deprecated. 1.6 is very deprecated, so you should pick 1.8. You can do Java or Groovy. And you can pick a Spring Boot version. You typically would use the latest release one. And then this is the interesting part here. There's a whole bunch of sub-projects that you can get most of them I don't think generate code. They generate POM entries so that the code that you do generate will have references to the code that you're going to depend upon. We're not going to use most of these, but there are some really interesting ones here, like Baden, which is it's built on GWT to build UIs that you write in Java and it generates JavaScript. So that's kind of interesting. Jersey, which is for like REST applications. Let's see, Spring Security. So there's some of the stuff that might apply to your situation. Well, I don't know if it handles session per se, but some of the security implications around that. Template engines, we're going to go look at FreeMarker down the line here. There's things for JPA, which you talked about with Hibernate, several databases, lots of different things here.
What are the Groovy templates up there?
Groovy templates. I think Groovy has its own template language. Is that the case that you can use for generating web apps? So Mustache is one that's commonly used, I think, in the JavaScript world. Timeleaf is one that Spring supports really directly that does a nice job with like XHTML, I think. Velocity, I think, hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, so I prefer FreeMarker because it's actively developed. We're going to look at that.
Could you compare this with Spring Tool Suite? Is this redundant?
Well, we'll talk about that. I'll be using that, so I'll show you and I'll point out some of the things that it gives you. So, remind me maybe to repeat some of the questions because I don't know if they'll all be heard on the microphone, so if you could, I'll try to remember to do that. And then Actuator, which is this new piece that we're going to show you. So, the reason, I just wanted to skim this so that you could see that all of these features are here. I'm not going to generate the web app here, and the reason is because I'm going to generate it within Eclipse. Oh man, I forgot to delete my demo. See, that was my test. I was going to have a pristine environment here, so we're building from scratch. So there was a question about STS, and that's the Spring Tool Suite. So the Spring has provided a set of Eclipse plugins, or even actually a separate download that's built on Eclipse that they call STS, or Spring Tool Suite, that gives you a number of additions to Eclipse that make it easier to work with Spring projects. I should ask this, I'll try to be fairly unbiased about it. How many IntelliJ users do we have in the room? And how many Eclipse users? Okay, we've got some.
I like that.
Yes.
So I use Eclipse, Tyler uses IntelliJ, and we get along. So when I do my part of the demo, we're going to do it in Eclipse. When he does his part, we're going to do it in IntelliJ.
I guarantee you that Jeff's faster with Eclipse than I am with IntelliJ.
So what I wanted to show you here is that that wizard page that we saw on the web is available within STS. So we can go here and see it's laid out a little bit differently because there's a little less real estate. But it's the same idea. So what we're going to say is, we call this Spring Boot intro, and we're going to do Maven, we'll do jar, Java, 1.8, all the things we were talking about.
How do I decide between jar and war?
That's a good question. I'll come to that actually not too long from now.
Okay.
Yeah, actually that's a really good idea. Okay, so we have a demo project for Spring Boot. I'm going to copy my. Okay, we got to pick the parts that we want to put in here. So I'm going to keep it simple to start out with. I'm just going to select actuator, which I haven't yet told you about, but I told you that we're going to talk about, and free marker. Tell me where free marker is.
It's right there in the writing column for now.
There you go. All right. And it's looking, showing you where the base URL is that it's actually using to generate it. So you can pass in your own parameters here, it looks like, and you can generate your own zip file if you assemble the right command line. Okay, so this is your standard Maven project in Eclipse. And I will tell you right now that this is a runnable project. It has one file, and it has a POM. So let's run it. If anybody has trouble seeing this, we got an error right away, excellent. If anybody has trouble seeing this, let me know. I have a little zoom feature, so I'm going to zoom in on the things that we need to see. Also, if anybody needs to move forward a little bit, please do. Okay, so I recognize this error. It says, cannot find template locations. So I'm going to come back to this. So as I said, I wanted to get those dependencies in there right away, but I don't actually want to use them because it adds more complexity, as we see in the form of an error. So let's try it again. It started up so fast I actually didn't see the line here. It says started Spring Boot intro application in 1.299 seconds. So it had only one class file, which we haven't yet looked at, and you can imagine it doesn't take very long to start that. Oh, you know what we did? We didn't do web. Because I was going to say, well, we should go to our app. Didn't work. So how many of you use this XML editor in Eclipse for POMs? Have you used this? There's a lot of really cool features in here that you should get to know. Oh, I don't have an index. That makes it hard.
And you could have gotten the same effect by clicking the web checkbox?
Yes.
Yeah, basically that's creating like a pre-generated POM for you, and like all the dependencies just right there, so you can hop right in. Is it because it's already running?
Is it because what?
It's already running.
It says something was already running. Okay, so that time I saw some output, so let's look at it again. All right, now we see starting Tomcat, and we see some stuff about, or output about servlets. It started in 3 seconds, which takes a little bit longer. So let's go back over here and look at our app. Oh, we got an error. Well, we don't have any web pages actually written. So let's look at the app and see what's it doing. It successfully started Tomcat, but I don't know what it's supposed to do. So when you generate a Spring Boot app, and every app that you'll start with will essentially look like this in all likelihood. And what it is the main bootstrap. So this is the boot in Spring Boot. I'm going to zoom in. Actually, let's just go like this. And let's talk about each of the components. So it's got your standard public static void main that some people complain about making Java apps too hard to bootstrap. And it kind of turns it into a bit of an asset here, because all it does is turn around and call Spring Application.run, passing your class name, Spring Boot, or I can suppose my class in this case, Spring Boot Intro Application.class, passing it the args. And the other magical piece here is this @Spring Boot application. Well, there's a great deal that goes into this whole process, and so we're going to break it down a little bit at a time. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to go out to the command line, and let's do Maven there for a moment, and let's talk about this jar versus war question that came up. So we're going to build our app. And I want to show you that when we build it, it's going to build it as a jar. Yeah, it's going to download the world, you know how it goes. So let's look in Target. It has a Spring Boot app, standard nomenclature, snapshot.jar. And I'm going to do a java-jar. And I'm just going to run this jar directly. Oh, did I stop it on the other side, or are we going to get a bind error?
You're probably
Yeah, we're going to get a bind error. All right, well, let's go stop it over here. And let's run it again. Okay, so we have our app started again. And I didn't show you this before, but there actually is an endpoint we can go to that works, just not the root one. So let's go to mappings. And mappings is a very useful endpoint for you with Spring Boot, specifically with Actuator. This is provided by that Actuator subproject. So, or dependency, let's call it a dependency. So when you add Actuator as a dependency in your Spring Boot app, it will automatically register a whole set of endpoints that you can use to see how Spring Boot started up, and a lot of the details on how the configuration works and so on. And we're going to go into a number of these, but we have to break down all the steps one by one. So we're kind of coming in from a number of different angles. Right now we're going to look at how the jar gets created, and this is going to tie into the Maven component. So we built this jar, and now I'm going to stop running this for a second, because what I want to do is I want to show you the jar, so that you can see how it's put together. So when we look at this jar, it has your metadata folder and your manifest that you have in most jars. It has the typical Maven little tree here with the POM and the POM properties. But this is new and different. It has a lib directory with all your dependencies. There's Tomcat in there, Spring Web MVC, AOP line stuff, Jackson, a bunch of freebies. Here it has our class file, Spring Boot Intro Application. There's an application properties I haven't shown you yet. And then there's this other funky stuff, this org Spring Framework boot loader archive. So you may have been wondering, we built a jar, we ran the jar, we saw Tomcat in the output. How the heck did that happen? Right? I didn't deploy it to Tomcat. Tomcat's embedded in my app. But if I embedded Tomcat in my app, where did my class path come from? Like, how did my class loader work? It doesn't fit the usual way of writing Java apps, right? So the way that it works is it has to have a little bit of bootstrap code, and that's what we're seeing at the bottom here, that contributes a new class loader. And then it embeds all your dependencies as jars inside your jar. And if you know about the standard class loader in Java, it doesn't know how to read nested jars. that would have been a nice feature maybe a long time ago, but it's never been implemented that way in standard Java. But when you have a Spring Boot app and you bootstrap it with that main class, which then turns around and calls into Spring's code here, then you get that bootstrapping. The question came up though, what's the difference between a jar and a war? There's almost no difference. In fact, you can set the packaging type in your POM as war, and when you do your Maven clean install, it'll generate it as a war. And you can take that war and you can drop it into Tomcat, or you can drop it into Jetty, and it will operate just as the wars, that you've built before work.
But will it be Spring Boot if it's a war?
It will still be Spring Boot.
You still have all the same hooks to everything.
There will be a few differences potentially because it will be using, you potentially can inherit, for instance, the libraries that Tomcat itself provides. So you can have some things in your class loader that aren't strictly from your war. So there potentially could be some more complexities in that. But the way that Spring Boot, again, I told you it was opinionated, the way that they suggest that you write apps is you build runnable wars or runnable jars, and you just run them directly. And if I were to, I'm not going to take the time to do it because we have other things to look at, but if I just change that type to war, and then I do a Maven clean install, and I do java-jar, blah, 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 dot war, it will still run.
As in a rename?
Well, I could rename it as well, but there may be, I haven't looked closely to see if I actually change the packaging type to war versus jar, I haven't looked closely to see if it actually generates different contents inside it. It may or may not, I'm not certain. But what I'm saying is that even if I do choose to build it as a war, it's still runnable on the command line. So if I want to hedge my bets, like I don't know if I want to deploy it to Tomcat or not, then I can choose to build it as a war, and I can run it on the command line when I want to, maybe locally on my machine. But if I want to deploy it somewhere else, and I've got ops people who say, well, you got to run it in Tomcat, then I can drop it into Tomcat.
Okay, so war is more flexible to Java.
Well, yeah, potentially. Personally, I prefer the cleanliness of the jar and not having that, even having that option. But certainly, it could be in your circumstance.
So this isn't actually that important, critical, but you mentioned Jetty.
Yeah.
Is it pretty compatible with Jetty too?
Yeah. So I wanted to show that, but it's slightly complicated because this is a new Eclipse environment that I set up, and so I don't have the index going, so it doesn't resolve my dependencies quite as easily with my autocomplete like I'm used to. But to get Jetty instead of Tomcat, all you have to do is do an exclude on the Tomcat dependency and add the Jetty dependency. Not Jetty itself, but the Spring Boot starter for it. And I'll show you that in a minute here. I can show you exactly how to do that. I just might not actually do it.
But I also point out that you don't actually need to.
Right. So yeah, if you're familiar with Jetty, they've actually been preaching this model for many years. In fact, I think from the very beginning of Jetty is they said, don't run your app in the container, run your container in the app. And that's exactly where Spring Boot has gone. They've chosen to use Tomcat as the default. I don't know why. I like Jetty, so at least I especially like Jetty in this case because it just fits my model of how Jetty should be used. I'm more familiar with dropping wars into Tomcat, so if I do it that model, I usually use Tomcat. Maybe that's inconsistent, but that's just the way that I've kind of operated. So now we've seen that we have a whole app. We've seen that it has an endpoint. In fact, it has multiple endpoints that I'll show you in a few minutes here, and it has just really essentially one line of code and an annotation. So let's look at the POM a little bit more to see how we got all that, because there's clearly some magic going on. Let's kind of break apart some of that magic. It's not a very big POM, I'll show you that. So we have our usual group ID, artifact ID, version, packaging, the usual stuff. This one's kind of important. It's not strictly necessary. It does make things easier, so I highly recommend using the Spring Boot starter parent as your parent. Should I be zooming in on this? Does that help? Okay. I'll explain why in a minute. So let's come back to why we might want to do that. What are they gifting us that makes it worthwhile to have them as our parent? It sets a few properties. Remember I said I wanted Java 1.8? So they reference in their build the Java version property. So if I want to override the default, which actually is 1.7, I believe, then I need to set that here. And I need to indicate what my start class is because it needs to be generated into the manifest that we saw when we exploded the jar. It needs to know what to run, so that's how it knows. We have here a few dependencies, but not very many. We have Spring Boot Starter Actuator, Spring Boot Starter Web. Remember the first time I ran it, it didn't start Tomcat. It started Tomcat after I added Spring Boot Starter Web, and we'll explain how that works. And Actuator is what gave us all those fancy endpoints that I'm just hinting at so far. And then there's a Spring Boot Starter Test, which we also haven't looked at. And then here's another key piece. We have to say, well, use the Spring Boot Maven plugin to build my jar. And that's the thing that knows how to build a jar that has that nested lib directory that has all your dependencies in it, and that sets up your manifest correctly, and so on. So this is a crucial piece, and then the parent is a crucial piece. If you have those two in your POM, then you're pretty much a Spring Boot app. You're probably going to want to inherit something else here, and let's look at that. So one of the features that I really like in Eclipse is Maven Support. This is not a Spring feature, but if you've never gone into the POM editor, into the dependency hierarchy, this is really cool. If you ever do Maven dependency tree, tree, you can see your list of dependencies, and it's a really useful tool for figuring out, well, I know that I'm depending on Jackson. How did I get it? Because I don't have a dependency on Jackson, so I must have picked it up transitively. And you can use the tree to figure that out. The problem with Maven dependency tree is it only shows you the most direct route. It doesn't show you all the possible ways that you could get to Jackson. And so if you have, for instance, two different versions of Jackson on your class path, it's going to resolve to one. And Maven has its own logic on how it's going to resolve a dependency. And if it's picked the wrong one, it's kind of hard to debug. So this tool, if you're an Eclipse user and have this available to you, is super powerful because you can find out, well, I get Jackson data bind from Spring Boot Starter Actuator, and I can get it from Spring Boot Starter Web, and it's like they're the same version, so that's good. They're 2.4.5. Here's the annotations, which is 2.4.0 that's been overridden. So you get a lot of information about multiple different paths to a particular dependency. And then the list on the right is, well, what does Maven actually end up resolving? What's actually going to end up in that lib directory inside your jar? That's what this list is. So this helps you find the multiple paths. This shows you the universal list, the singular list of what's going to make it in there. And it also grays out your test scope dependencies, so you can kind of see the difference between them. In fact, this is one I didn't see before. Oh, can you do it here? There's somewhere that I think you can change the scope. Yeah, here it goes. You can change which scope you're viewing as well, which is also valuable. So anyway, one of the things that we saw was, well, we got Tomcat. So where did we get Tomcat from? So Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. So within that, that's where we got the real Tomcat. So they have a wrapper. They've got something that pulls it in for us. Well, if you right-click on that and you say exclude Maven, oh, you know what I should do? Maybe I can do Jetty. I think I got time. Let's do this. So I have to see the full name. This shows me the group ID. If you have that off, you'll only see the artifact ID. Right? So I need to see its org Spring Framework boot, and then Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. So what we'll do is we'll exclude that Maven dependency. And now if I go back over here and look in the POM, it says I have an exclusion now within Spring Boot Starter Web on Tomcat. But now I don't have any container, so I need to add another one back. So let's just do this. Change that to Jetty. Did you notice there are no version numbers on any of these? Yeah. Come back to that in a second.
You mentioned
How come you didn't do a right click and say add dependency? Did you have that?
Because the index isn't installed, so it's not auto-completing for me, so I don't benefit from that. So in this case, copy-paste seems faster to me.
Now, what were the two things you clicked to get? I'm trying to follow along. What was the initial two checkboxes that you clicked to get here?
Good question. Let me,
It was actuator and web.
Actually,
Actuator and web, yeah. No, actuator and free marker.
this is
And
so
then we added web.
in the POM. The question was, what were the two dependencies you started with?
yeah, in the checkbox from these.
I picked actuator and free marker, and I forgot web.
Okay.
So then I had to add web and comment it out free marker so we can come back to it later. Okay, so now we've excluded Tomcat, we've added Jetty. Now we look at our console, and it says Jetty started on port 8080. So does our app still work? App still works. Hey. Okay, so that's kind of auto-magical, isn't it? How the heck does that work? I'm glad you asked.
It's almost something.
Let's dig a little deeper first. I want to show you the parent POM, because I think I promised you that. So you can command click and go into your parent POM here. This is the Spring Boot parent, Spring Boot starter parent. I'm just going to skim it because mostly we don't care. Oh my, the default's 1.6. That's kind of sad. Here's where it uses the Java version, right? The property that we overrode, and here's the default. Are you familiar with dependency management as opposed to dependencies in Maven POM? Is there anyone who feels pretty comfortable with the idea of dependency management? And I'm going to assume everyone else is a no, so. Okay.
Because we want you to explain it.
We're like half and half, right? So, okay, so dependency management is a way for you to say in a parent POM, in other words, a POM that's meant to have others declare it as a parent. It's a way to say these are the default values for the dependencies that I include. So I can say, for instance, that if somebody marks me as a parent and they say they depend on Spring Core, then their default version, unless they override it in other words, will be spring.version, which is from this other property, right? Oh, in fact, here, it's not specified, so I may have to specify that. So that property has to be available somewhere. And then it has exclusions, so you can actually inherit exclusions from your parent. That's the only one that's in here.
Wait, if you inherit but exclude, that means you've got to provide some logging, but it'll provide you with a Spring framework? What?
Right, so what it says is I'll inherit Spring Core, but I won't inherit this particular dependency that I would otherwise inherit transitively.
So, okay. Bring your own logging, but I'll give you the core.
Well, with respect to this particular one, Commons logging is vile and you don't ever want it. But Spring has depended on it for many years and they don't want to break compatibility. So Spring itself continues to have a dependency on Commons logging. And most of the projects at Spring will continue to have it as a dependency. But Spring Boot, they decided to make a break.
At this point, they're like dropping.
They decided to make a break. And the reason why is Commons logging has class loader problems in certain scenarios. So the better choice in almost all cases is to use SLF4J. So they exclude Commons logging and then replace it with JCL over SLF4J.
Somewhere further down, there's a logging that'll make it work without loading it.
Exactly, and I'll show you where that is as well. But it's worth mentioning that if you're using Commons logging, you probably shouldn't. You should probably be using SLF4J in most cases. And if you have both, you can end up with both Commons logging and JCL over SLF4J, and they'll collide at a class level. So you want to make sure you only have one or the other. That's kind of out of scope. That's just a free bonus tip.
I thought they were waiting for you to do it, but you're saying this file will get the complete set.
Well, this keeps it from leaking in from this particular angle. So if they do their job on all of the Spring dependencies that they provide you through the Spring Boot, POMs, then you shouldn't end up with Commons logging. But if you pull in some other Spring dependency that's not a Spring Boot one, you may get it, and then it's up to you to exclude it. But you need to do that anyway, right? Because you're going to look at all of your dependencies from wherever you get them and say, is Commons logging there? Well, if it is, I don't want it to be there. You're always going to have to figure that out if you're doing logging anyway. So this is nothing new in the Maven world, I would argue. It also has defaults for plugin management and some things like that. So if you say that this is my parent, then you'll get all these behaviors. So it'll have plugin configuration. Here's some important stuff that we're going to touch on later on around how it knows how to do some of the automagical things using these meta-inf files. So we'll come back briefly on that. The next thing I want to show you really quickly is that this depends itself on Spring Boot dependencies. And so Spring Boot dependencies is the top of the chain. There is no other parent here. And if you look here, there's a bunch of properties. Oh, here's where we get that Spring version, I bet. Because there's a whole load of properties for all these different dependencies like Liquibase and Log4j and Log4j2 and Logback. Well, that's kind of weird. And Reactor, a bunch of Spring projects, Velocity, Time Leaf, you know what, this is kind of a lot like that whole list of things that had checkboxes on that other screen, right? So what they're saying with that other screen is that these are the things that we sort of directly support, and we'll generate some stuff for you. And here's the POM that says, here's the default versions of those that we know how to work with and to be compatible with. And there's code associated with a lot of these that we're going to touch on. So when we look down, though, after all those properties, we get to dependency management, which again, I told you is the defaults on all of these things. So we're defaulting to Spring Boot 123 release, Actuator 123 release, all these other guys. So hey, wait a minute, that's Actuator, that's one we depended on, and we never set the version on it, right? Well, we didn't have to set the version because 2 steps away, Spring Boot starter parent, Spring Boot starter dependencies, it declared it up there, and we get those by default. And we probably don't want to override it here, and in fact, Eclipse will warn you if you're overriding it, I think. So see here, it's going to do a hover, and it says the managed version is 123 release. So it's saying somebody else is setting that for you. So you want to probably keep that unless you have some reason to break it, because if you choose another one, there's a possibility there's a compatibility issue. The magic here of this POM that Spring has put together is that, to the best of their ability, they've picked a bunch of things that are actually compatible with each other, and that can dramatically reduce, your dependency hell that you sometimes run into in other cases. So the magic here, at the risk of going on too much of a tangent, you can choose not to declare this parent, and then you build your own jar. Put your own contents in, do whatever you want with it. You don't have to take their magical stuff on how it's built. If you want to get that dependency set, though, all of the dependency management, have you heard of the word BOM? It's become into a little bit of use in Maven, BOM, Bill of Materials. So a Bill of Materials is what this is. It's a special kind of POM that doesn't have behavior, like it doesn't have a build block, a plugin configuration, and all that. All it has is a dependency management block. And Maven allows you to do a dependency management here. Where, again, I don't think it's going to resolve automatically, so I don't know if I want to do the whole thing, but you can reference this other POM. This is easy enough to do. Just do it like this. If I reference in a dependency management block, so even right above my actual dependencies, and I put in a BOM, the key is that I have to say my scope here is import. And if I use scope import on something that I reference, a dependency that I reference in my dependency management block, then I'll inherit all those configurations, all of those versions, without having to have it as a parent. And that's a super powerful feature in Maven that was missing for quite a number of years. It's been available now for several years. If you're not using that, that can really simplify a lot of things for you, because the alternative sometimes is to have these really weird, deep hierarchies of POMs, and they just become really hard to maintain. Like maybe you have a corporate super POM that sets your nexus, and then you have underneath that your division or your team or whatever, and then under that you have a bunch of other stuff you contribute. And it can get really messy, especially when you start having different apps that start having different sets of dependencies and different versions. And so this simplifies things a lot if you have those as a mix-in.
So what that stands in the way of everything else, or everything you already have plus what's listed there.
So
I
wouldn't do this at the same time as having it through my parent. I would remove it. So what I'm trying to say is, if you have some reason why, maybe in your company you have to have a corporate super POM that you use, right? You're not allowed to just depend on the Spring Boot parent. You can still get all those dependencies from their BOM by doing it as a mix-in using this technique. Is where I'm going with that.
Import
so I have taken the risk of going too deep into Maven land here.
Oh, okay.
But this is something that if you want to introduce it and you're running into resistance because you have a corporate policy, that's why I'm mentioning it, because I've been in places that are like that. So that said, I'm going to abandon this because we don't need it.
Skipping up the tree and saying that one, I want that one.
well, what you're saying is, I want to get my dependencies from here, but I have a parent from over here that has my behavior. So parents really is where you should get your behavior from as far as plugin configuration, and the mix-in is where you should get your dependencies from. It used to be you couldn't split the two. You got them both from your parent, right?
Super.
All right, we're not going to talk about that anymore.
That's super good.
We're going to get into the more fun stuff, because we don't want to look at XML all day.
Yeah.
But you need to know how this works, because once you get it in there, then all this magic happens, and we don't really want it to be magic. We want to be, in control of it. So we need to know that that's how the dependencies work, and that's why there are version numbers here. And many of the things that we want by default are already going to have versions. And if they don't, we can add any dependency that we want here, just like any other project that we would do in Java. But know that there are already a set of dependencies that are sort of established to work together. And so if we pick another one that's incompatible, we just need to be aware of the possible risks that we're taking on. So Spring's done a lot of hard work for us, and let's honor that, and then go off in our direction as much as we need to do our work. Good? Okay, so that's about as much as I want to do right there. So let's go back. We just covered this line of code and how it bootstraps, sort of, and how we build the jar. Are we ready for the annotation? Okay. So the annotation, when we click on that, this annotation is Spring Boot application. And this actually came a little more recently in Spring Boot. Previously you had to have several annotations, and they realized it kind of made sense to just roll them up into one. So there's add configuration, add enable auto configuration, and add component scan. So add configuration is used in what we call Java config. So we're going to start talking about this soon. In general, it's not necessary to use Spring XML anymore. And really there's a lot more power and flexibility in creating your beans through Java. And so I highly recommend you looking into this Java config and abandoning the old XML. If you need to use it, you can still use it and it'll work happily. You don't have to get rid of it. But I would begin to move away from it. There are a number of reasons why, and we may not go deep into them. I actually thought there might be a little more familiarity with that, so I didn't head that direction in my prep for this. But if it's something we want to delve into later and there's time, maybe we can. But talking about these three, add configuration says that this file is a configuration file for Spring Boot that may have bean definitions corresponding to the beans that you would have in an XML file. It's not obligated to, and our app doesn't have any. So personally, I kind of prefer keeping this application clean and doing my config in another file. So I'll probably recommend that to you guys. You can.
So the properties of this file become beans in the general Spring context?
So if you were to have an @bean annotation in here, then it would detect that, oh, you're declaring a bean because this is a configuration file, and I know to look for beans because this is annotated with @configuration, transitively through this Spring Boot application.
And it could use those in some other bean that says, I want a something, and
Well,
there it is.
So let me make one, just so we can have one to look at. Let's just call it Spring Boot Intro Config. And now this becomes real, right? So then we say add configuration. All right, so now I have a configuration, okay? It doesn't have to have any beans in it, but it might. So because the Spring Boot application has this other annotation here, component scan, what component scan does is it says, well, let's start at this package, that is the package for my app, which is com.dev9spring.boot. And starting from this place in my class path hierarchy and underneath it, scan every class and look for an add configuration annotation. So if I find one, then I know I've got some beans, or at least the potential for beans. For which?
It's also going to look for add component.
Yeah, actually there are several others that will also look for add service, add component, but add configuration is the one that you would use for configs that would declare other beans. But a class can already be, if it's annotated correctly, it can actually configure itself. It doesn't need to be configured by a configuration. We may or may not go into that. It's actually probably what we heard. So yeah, it'll be there. We'll totally cover that. So then the last one here is the enable auto configuration. And this is the thing that starts to look for stuff in your class path that's going to be automagical, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And it's going to do, well, I think those things that are annotated at configuration probably wouldn't get picked up if we didn't have the add enabled.
Yeah, you need the auto configuration.
So, in any case, by putting that on your class, you get all the freebies. We'll talk about how it works now. But that's all that you need to have in this class. That's all that you'll ever really need to have in this class. Because from here on out, you just start creating beans within your hierarchy, annotating them accordingly, or putting them in these config files that have the add configuration annotation. And as long as they're in your hierarchy, you're good. I've been in projects in the past that did like XML, where they do component scan and they're like, put it at like com.mycompany or whatever, and they have all these dependencies and they're scanning the world, and that really affects your startup time. So make sure you're using your package name to narrow down where you're scanning from, because if you have other dependencies, for instance, that are from the com dev9 workspace, you want to make sure that you don't scan them unless you intend to. And you can choose to scan other packages. You can put your own. Again, I'm at risk of getting off track a little bit. You can put other annotations here to tell it to scan other things. You can also import, your resource. So if I really can't get away from my application context.xml, you can do that, and now it becomes part of your Spring app, and it's added to your context. So lots of things that you can do with that.
To prevent this, scan the whole class hierarchy.
Right.
You put your application sort of off on a branch a little bit.
No, what I'm saying is for this application, make a deep enough package name that's distinct enough from the other applications that might be in your class path, that you know that you're just going to scan this application below, not everything else that might be in your corporate hierarchy.
Just put it up under the top.
So
and
just make a little bit deeper package than you might otherwise. Don't put everything under ComDev9 and then leave it at the root and you'll scan from there.
I've got an example of that with my stuff too. You'll kind of see the way we've been creating them, and on our projects, we generally put it kind of at where it would be like spring.boot, and then we put the initializer, and then everything underneath that is a package underneath that. So it just scans down, right? It doesn't scan up. It's very horizontal.
Well, just to clarify, this is called an initializer in some contexts. And sometimes people call this Spring Boot intro initializer, just to clarify the nomenclature. So let's close these guys because they're just distracting. So we have an app. It knows how to scan to create new beans, to load configurations. We have a config, which is a placeholder. We should probably figure out what to put there at some point. But I want to go back and I want to look at some of those things that Actuator gave us, because figuring out how all this works is really valuable. Actually, before I do that, I want to show you the application properties. Let's do this first. So when it generated the app, so I didn't create application properties, right? That was one that was generated for me. I created this application properties file. You can see this little leafy thing. That logo comes from the STS, the Spring Tools suite. So it turns out that if I do a control space here, it actually shows me a bunch of properties that it knows about. And the new version of STS that I think is in a milestone release and hasn't been released yet has support for the YAML editor, which I will now recommend that you do instead of the properties. The only reason I have the properties one is because I can get the autocomplete on those properties right now. But you might prefer YAML, and I'll show you why.
You guys familiar with YAML?
Yeah, so YAML is a fairly widely used configuration syntax that it's sort of like a...
It's yet another markup.
Yeah, it's yet another markup language, but it's often mentioned to be basically a reformulation of JSON, but without the brackets. So it's basically a compatible structure. So I can't see it here by doing a control space, but let's find an example over here. If I say spring dot application name, let's take that one. That's a decent one. So we say spring dot application name, and we decide to call this Spring Boot intro.
Is indentation significant?
Yes.
Not how much there is, but the fact that it's there is significant. So I think any additional white space on each line
Yeah.
is significant.
No, it understands it, looks at your outlines there.
Yeah, so I mean, I have colorization in this editor, but I don't know if this is an STS YAML editor, if I download it from somewhere or what. But STS's new release will have one that actually is able to look at your B definitions and other things so that it knows what it has available. Trying to figure out what we can best do with this. There's a lot of different directions we can go here.
Change the port if you want to or something like that. When that works there.
Yeah, let's come back to that. I want to show you first of all that so you can have a Spring Boot YAML. Actually, let's go back to FreeMarker because then that makes this more. No. I know where we're going to go. Let's do auto configuration. So we have all this magical stuff. How did it happen? How did it know to start up Tomcat? How did it know to start up Jetty? Right. Let's look into that. I'm gonna jump ahead and then kind of work backwards. Did we leave Jetty on our class path, or did we leave Tomcat there? Let's add FreeMarker now. Let's do that. Yeah, let's bring it back. So has anybody used FreeMarker? Okay, we got one, all right. So it would kind of be fun if our app did something. Oh, it says class path templates out there. Looks like it's there. I think the problem is that there's no file there, so let's add a file. I'm gonna write by hand HTML. Do you want to watch me do that? All right, maybe we should have a message. All right, will that now run? All right, we ran. Okay, well, does it work? Oh, man, it didn't work. Oh, look at that though. Error. Come back to that. There's no explicit mapping for error.
Need an error template or something?
You can add an error template.
I don't know that. I mean, that's the question. I don't know
No, you can. Yeah.
that.
You can add an error template.
Is that like the simplest thing? Is kind of.
I'll show the error message. Yeah, so it says there's no explicit mapping for it. So any of these times you see a white label, it'll say like white label block page. Those are pages that you can overwrite and then add in your own templates so you guys have custom errors or custom sort of like 404s or anything like that.
So we got a 404, there's nobody handling this endpoint. Well, let's make somebody that can handle it. So, Spring Boot Intro Controller. If you see me typing the whole word, yell at me to use autocomplete. So that's what I do.
It must be a great pair programmer.
Oh, he's wonderful, let me tell you.
Yeah, there was a fellow that I learned from. There's the first guy that I learned pairing from who would physically hit my wrist if I type something out and it was autocomplete.
Dev 9 does not condone.
It was a little frustrating.
this.
I think you know this fellow. I won't name him, but yeah, he actually was a really good teacher because it breaks him. I mean, if I use too many keystrokes to select something and then copy and duplicate it and move it, he would tell me you took too many strokes. And it's a very effective tactic. Okay, I wonder if that'll work. Does that work? I don't know.
Let's find out.
It only takes like 3 seconds to start, so we might as well try it.
That says everything is mapped to that controller.
Yeah, that's still good.
That's what you're requesting.
What's that?
Putting in there.
Yep, so I gotta go to rewrite. I don't know, so that didn't work. Okay, well then we better add something else. Let's add another request pattern. Let's just say, template tags. Let's do this. We just say welcome. So this is Spring MVC. Does anybody use Spring MVC? Okay, a little bit. See if that works. Oops. Took off my welcome. Oh look, now we got it. Well, I think we can do better.
But now you want to go to the page.
What's that?
But you have a page that you want to do.
Well, I mean, I did go to that page. So what I did here, just to explain the magic, is that I told it a view name, and then it has a view resolver, and then it has to go and find the view. Well, because I used the name welcome, then the view resolver, which knows about FreeMarker, which I haven't explained how it knows about FreeMarker, said, well, I've got this welcome FTL file, so let me render that. Okay? So it's doing some magic stuff again, which we'll try to make less magical by the end. But I want to go a little step further here because I want to be able to pick what I go to. I don't want it to just pick for me. So yeah, audit completed. Did you see me do that method?
Good, good.
Good work.
All right, think this will work? So now I said take my path param, and I said give that to me as a template name, and then return that template name.
That's the
Okay.
universal controller.
Hey, it still worked. How did that work? Because that doesn't match a template name. And I'm still getting that darned error.
Well, I think we had some page.
So I'm going to save you from watching me type another page of HTML.
What's that extension, FTL?
FTL. You can make that whatever you want, but the default is FTL. So I have some folks at my client who kind of, they get a little weird about like the FTL, and they kind of like it to just be HTML, but they don't mind inside it you can do tags and things. So they don't mind the idea of having, you know, a FreeMarker tag inside a FreeMarker syntax. But they'd like to just have the name be HTML. So I'm kind of just trying to say, you know, it's the same thing, and the user doesn't care. So I like to have it explicit in the extension that it's FreeMarker, because then when you look inside and you see that syntax, you're like, oh, that syntax corresponds to the file name. So for me, that's clarification.
Okay, and when I create, okay, I just tell Eclipse that I want FTL extension.
Change the title. Right, perfect.
Yep. Actually, maybe I should have waited longer. I think there's like a 10-second cache on that. Totally blew that down for sure. So this is an error. This isn't. Okay, so now we see that not only are we able to resolve other templates, and I guess for completeness sake, although he's the one who least needs to be welcomed probably because you guys are the guests. Alright, I'm just going to wait for a few seconds. I don't know if this will work or not, but just in case, if I wait, has it been like 10 seconds or so? Actually, for a new file, it should look right away. It shouldn't cache it. So I did restart it, right? It picked up. And let's can go further with that, and maybe we will, but we keep doing this looping back, and drilling in a little deeper, and then coming back out and drilling deeper. So,
So, real quick, do you guys, the topics list we just started, that was a pretty short list because we hadn't gotten into anything. Is there anything, since you've seen this, that you now, like a direction you want to go, or this is raising any additional questions you guys might have? All right, same course.
all right. So, for me, one of the things that's really vital to understand about what Spring Boot is doing, and I think I stated this, but in case I didn't state it totally clearly, you don't need Spring Boot to do Spring, right? And Spring Boot doesn't really change fundamentally anything about Spring. You can use Spring MVC and all the other stuff that you might have been using before, and don't have to use Spring Boot. What Spring Boot does is it kind of draws it all together and gives you a new, easy way to boot it up and to deploy it and to configure it and all of that. That I think is a really compelling argument for how to build apps. But because it does a lot of this stuff through, convention over configuration and such, it's a little bit unclear sometimes to see how the magic is happening. So I'm going to continue to keep kind of opening it up and digging deeper, and that's why I'm doing it with code and not PowerPoint, because I want you to see how this works, so that when you start messing with it and something breaks and doesn't work like you want it to, you know where to go with it, because otherwise you're kind of up a creek, because all this stuff happened without you configuring anything, so like where do you go to figure out what happened?
So what was the name of the template library you're using there? It's called Free what?
FreeMarker.
FreeMarker.
And you can just go to freemarker.org, it's open source. The reason that I like it is like Timely, for instance, is, which is another nice templating language, it seems to be oriented towards tag languages like XHTML, and maybe HTML, I don't even know if it does that for sure, but FreeMarker is just sort of like free text, so you can use it for any kind of textual file. So it has a little bit more flexibility in that respect.
Now, are you using any of the features of FreeMarker that looks like ordinary HTML to me?
Well, I did wait 10 seconds for it to cache. So yes and no, right? It is. Is that where you want to go? Do you want to see how it boots, or do you want to see how FreeMarker works? Was that? Okay, well then we'll come back to that. But that's a possibility for the demo. I'm totally happy to go there. But that's just FreeMarker. It's not necessarily Spring Boot.
Actually, I'm more interested in highlighting session tokens.
Well, but that's still potentially in there, not the session tokens. So we won't get to that. I'll promise you that right now. But there is Spring Session is a relatively new project where they pulled that out into its own thing. So if you haven't looked at it, look at Spring Session, and that may help you with some of your issues. Okay, we're going to look at a file. I'm going to jump ahead because it's kind of automagical for me to know that this exists. But once you know it exists, then it gives you somewhere to start. So I'll direct you there via FreeMarker. FreeMarker has a FreeMarker auto configuration. So remember I talked about the at configuration? So that says this is a configuration class, and it's going to provide some means. So it's going to put some means into my context. I wanted to go into this. We've spent more time in other areas, so I'm not going to be able to go into this very much, but this is a really cool feature in Spring Boot. This conditional on class, at conditional on class, and there's a whole bunch of these at conditional ons. I may not be able to see them here, but let me just there's conditional on bean, on class, on expression, on Java, on JNDI, on missing bean, missing class, web app, not web app, property resource, a bunch of these things. I'll show you how one or two of them work, and just know that there are others there that you can take advantage of as well to do the same kind of thing. So this conditional on class says, in order for this at configuration to be processed, these classes must exist on my class path. So I have to have a FreeMarker template configuration, and I have to have a FreeMarker configuration factory. Well, if we hover over them, it's obvious that this one is fully qualified, so it's obviously FreeMarker.template.configuration, so it's in the FreeMarker namespace, it's not a Spring thing. FreeMarker configuration factory, however, does have Org Spring Framework in its name, so it is from Spring. So we can already guess that they're from two different dependencies. So what we're doing here is we're saying, make sure that this dependency exists and make sure this other dependency exists. If they both exist, then I have all of the classes in my class path that I need in order to configure this thing. And if they don't exist, well then I can't configure this thing and these beans shouldn't be in my application context because I'll probably get, no class def found, or whatever, when I try to build this thing.
Can we split as many classes in that list as we want?
Yeah, but normally what you're trying to do is you want, these are just, they're tokens, right? It's a way of saying, does this artifact, we don't have a way to say this artifact exists.
So instead of obscure class coming up not found, that class comes up not found, and it makes more sense.
No. I'll show you actually, that's not the case at all, but I'll show you something that's even cooler. Because you won't ever get so far as to have an error.
So it doesn't error out on that? It just
No,
doesn't
what it
do
says
this
is
class?
this class doesn't exist, therefore I can't configure this
No, it
feature.
just skips this configuration. Here.
Right. So let me make this clear then. Let's look at this dependency. Spring Boot auto configure. So let's look at our POM because the POM knows all. So that Spring Boot auto configuration. Where did that come from? Spring Boot or auto configure. Okay, so I got that from Spring Boot Starter, which I got from Spring Boot Starter Actuator. And actually, if I didn't have Actuator, I would have Starter, because otherwise you don't have a Spring Boot app. So you're going to need one or both of those in your class path, which means I'm going to get auto configure anyway. Any Spring Boot app is going to have this auto configure, which means I'm going to have this class in my class path that says it's looking for free marker, right? So if I have free marker on my class path, and I have wherever this free marker, let's find out where this free marker configuration factory comes from. Oh, that comes from Spring Context Support. Okay, so if I have Spring Context, and just to clarify how I'm seeing that, up here I'm looking, well, I found this class, and I looked up and it came from Spring Context Support. Okay, so if that class, or if that artifact exists in my class path, and free marker exists in my class path, and there it is, then this configuration can be processed. So now it's going to auto-configure free marker because it discovers that free marker is in my class path, right? And it says auto-configure after web MVC auto-configuration. So there's a dependency here where it says probably, well, and I'll spoil it. I think there's a view resolver down below that says, where do I look for these templates to resolve these views? And it has to register with something that's defined in or configured by the web MVC auto-configuration. So that already has to be in place. That infrastructure has to exist. And then it enables this configuration property. So this is kind of cool. Let's check this out in just a second. No, let's look at it now, because then we won't forget. This is an evil feature. There's this add configuration properties with a prefix of spring.freemarker. And when we look down below, it's just, well, this isn't totally the best example because it just has a map. That's kind of a trick. It's kind of a cool trick. Template loader path. We should come back to this one maybe with Jalokia or something.
But the bean properties become things with a.b.
Yeah. So what will happen? Let me just show you how that works. So if I go over here and I do spring.freemarker, there's like template loader paths. I'm not sure where these others come from, how it knows about those. I think there's some other metadata that it must get for this particular feature to work. But this template loader path, if I were to set this, and by the way, the default there was class path colon templates, and what we saw early on was that the app failed to start because we didn't have a templates directory, or we didn't have anything in the templates directory. So that was, we solved that by putting a file in that directory. So you can say, this is where you would tell it to look somewhere else for those files. I don't want to get off topic too much here. The point here is that by having this add configuration properties and having this prefix, then by having this as a regular bean with getters and setters, they automatically get turned into property values that get evaluated and then injected when you do this enable configuration properties and then auto wire that class. So here free marker properties is the class that we said we want the configuration to be in, and then we auto wire that thing and we get a bunch of properties. And now we can access those properties to get various things. Oh, you know what it was? Is that pre-marker properties, it inherited from this abstract template view resolver properties. That's where these other things come from. So prefix, for instance, suffix. is expose request attributes. All of those things become available. So prefix, right? Suffix. Doesn't have is on the request because it changes the bean name. So it says request or expose request attributes. So those getters and setters on a regular old Java bean, not Spring Bean, right? Just a plain old Java bean become properties when you use that annotation. So that's a really cool little feature. So AutoWire, this is a fairly fundamental feature on the Java config. You can also, there's also a Java x.inject Java standard that has very slightly different behavior. I used to always use the @inject instead of @AutoWire, and I ran into the issue enough times that I committed to the Spring one and I just used @AutoWire, so I kind of recommend doing that. But any bean that your Spring application context knows about can be injected into another bean as it's being constructed. So since Spring knows about the application context, and then it can inject the application context when it's creating my free marker auto configuration. And then I can get stuff from that when I start up or even afterwards. There's also this post-construct annotation that says, run this initialization method, which can be arbitrarily named. So you can only have one though, and it has to have this post-construct. This is essentially the same as if you did old style beans, initializing bean, where it says after properties set. Do you remember that? This is the same thing if you've done that with old Spring. But this is doing it in an annotation style. And in fact, you could do the same thing. You could implement initializing bean here, and it would still process and run that after property set. This is just the annotation way to do it. Now, notice that it has these three static configuration classes inside. There's a free marker configuration, a free marker non-web, and a free marker web. And if you look at the non-web, it extends free marker configuration, and the web extends free marker configuration as well. So the difference between these is that this says @conditional on not web, and this says @conditional on web. So now I have all of the shared configuration in the parent class. And then I have two subclasses based on, am I running in a container or not? And it detects that automatically through processing this @conditional on not web application, right? So if I'm running in a web container, then I will do one configuration. If I'm not running in a web container, I do a different configuration. In this particular case, I'm guessing again that there's a view resolver. Yeah. So I don't need a view resolver if I'm not running in a web container. But I might still want to process templates for some reason. So this will allow it to work in either case. So now I have a very flexible system for doing configurations where it's detecting other things about my application state at startup or my application configuration at startup. Things that are in my class paths, things that are configured a certain way. Do other dependencies exist? And so on. Really powerful. And a lot of this stuff you get for free because if you look over here in this package explorer, this Spring Boot auto configure has stuff for AMQP, AOP, Cloud, JPA, Mongo, Solar, Jackson, JMS. So following the logic of what we just saw with free markers, simply by having something in my class path, something else gets configured to make that thing work for me. So that I don't have to do any configuration. I'll get useful defaults. So that's that convention over configuration that we're talking about. And many of these things have properties that if I go into my application YAML or my application properties, and I go in and I set that property, then I'm going to override the default. And they picked a useful default, 10-second timeout, or cache, on my free marker template. It's a reasonable default. But we're not going to have time to go into this. But through literally like 6 lines of configuration and a new dependency, I can tell my free marker app to load those templates from S3 out of Amazon. Simply by changing that.
This is where to load it from? Is that typically what?
Well, remember, so we have the spring.freemarker. Remember we looked at this? So here's my cache. Oh, that's enabled caching or not. This template loader paths. See how it says class path should be using my Zoom more. Class path templates is the default. Okay, but I can just as well change that to S3 colon something, my bucket name, right, my app templates. Okay, but I probably don't want to check every 10 seconds. I probably want to set that to something more like a minute or 2 or 5 or 10 or whatever, right? But the useful default is class path templates, and I don't have any complaints about that. All right, I think that's as far as I want to go with this part of how auto configuration works. I want to make sure that for Tyler at the end and for some questions. Is there anything else we want to go with that right now? So the one piece that I want to touch on then, before we leave auto configuration, is how it knows to do the auto configuration. Like, how did it even find those auto configuration classes? What if I want to write my own auto configuration? And we did this on our project, and it's actually really cool, because what we wanted to do was say, if we have a dependency on this one sort of like common library that we use in a lot of places, then wire up all of our metrics stuff for us, so that I don't have to code and configure how to write to statsd or which stuff to write to statsd. I just want to get it for free, right? So simply by having a dependency on that thing, I need Spring to discover in startup time that I have an auto configuration that I want to be processed and that I want it to build these beans for me. And the way that it does that is with this spring.factories file that's in this meta-inf dir. So inside this Spring Boot auto configure, there's this little magic file called spring.factories. And it has an initializer, auto configure, and template availability provider. So I'm not going to really go into great detail on those, but basically this is just a little simple properties file that Spring processes. So at startup time, it will scan your class path or your meta-inf directories for spring.factories file. And it'll look at all of them and look at the contents and find this list of properties and then process them accordingly. So here you have this thing, org Spring Framework boot auto configure, enable auto configuration. So remember our annotation at enable auto configuration. So we said in that if that thing's turned on, then go look for these Spring factories files. And there's these backslashes to continue the line. So these are all on one line. They're all set on that one property. So process all of these auto configurations, right? And so then there's free marker in there and HateOS, Jackson, and all these others. So that's these files, right? Each of these auto configuration files that's in here. So this is the thing that bootstraps the bootstrapping, right? That says go configure all these beans, process the auto configurations, see if these things are in my class path, see if these configuration values are turned on. One trick that some of them use is they say, auto configure this thing unless this property is turned off, because maybe I don't want that thing to be available all the time. For example, we haven't looked at all of our mappings. That's the thing that we got to do next. For example, we might be exposing some information at an endpoint in our test environment or locally that we don't want in prod, and so we can turn that off.
So this magic does not require searching an entire tree for auto config beans.
No.
There's this short list listed right here, the only ones that are going to be dealt with. But it turns out that not many of them are actually going to get fired because these other classes don't exist. Yeah, for example, you don't have the Solar and Elasticsearch and all kinds of strange libraries in your project. So skip. It's good.
We started in 3.7 seconds, remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to do all that.
Yeah,
so
we
we don't want a lot of work.
Yeah, and then we go, nope, and skip all the way down.
Right. Okay, so I know we've kind of been all over the place, but are we kind of resolving in on how this is all wired and how it all works? Okay, so let's go look at those mappings again, because I've been promising it, and you're not holding me to it. So now we know how it works. This kind of gets a bit interesting. Well, there's this beans. So let's see what beans we have. Okay, so Spring Boot Intro is the name of our app. We have a Spring Boot Intro application. wrote that, right? We have this intro config, which we didn't put anything in because we never figured out anything else that we needed to configure. We kind of had everything we needed. There's this intro controller that we wrote. So we can see the class, we can see where it's actually found. There's a property placeholder auto configuration, bean type registry. You know, we can't quite see on the side of the screen how the scroll bar, so we can I moved this so we can see more like how many beans there are. There's kind of a lot of beans because Spring, you know how it is, has to have all these little inner components that make everything work, like your MBean server and your MBean exporter and all this kind of stuff. Oh, do we want to see that? Or we might as well. We've got Visual VM here, so it's attached to our app. Okay, who's not used Visual VM? You need to download it, you need to get used to it. It comes free with Java if you call it JVisualVM. If you want the newer version, go look for Visual VM on java.net and download the newer release. Go to the Tools menu option and add all the plugins. And you're going to see a bunch of stuff going on inside your app that is really valuable. Here's your CPU usage and your heap. Here's the threads. You can sample your memory, your CPU. You can do profiling. Here's the MBeans that we're going to look at. You can see memory pools. There's a bunch of other stuff.
Is this talking to the MBeans?
Visual GC.
And this is separate?
Well, the MBeans one is, but no, there's an agent that you can attach to. By default, I think in everything in Java 1.6 and newer, unless you turn the security preference off, it's available. And so you can attach to this on a local machine. And if you run the agent on another machine, I think you can actually attach on a remote machine as well, and get all sorts of information about what's going on internally. So the one I want to show you here was your MBeans. If you've used JMX, Spring Boot has some MBeans that it exposes automatically. So all those are seen here.
Where does this come from again?
Visual VM, it's from Oracle. I mean, it was.
Oh, it's part of Java?
It's like JStack and JHat and all this. It's part of the suite of apps that you get for free. But I mean, if you don't have your kit or JProfile or something like that, this can get you a long way towards some of those same features at a better price point. So try this. It doesn't get you what you want. Spend all the money to get the real tool, but there's a lot of really powerful features in here to sample your data and see where you're consuming memory and what your GC behavior is like and all sorts of things.
What's the difference between this and JConsole?
JConsole is basically this one tab. There's no reason to use JConsole anymore because Visual VM does so much more. But it supports JConsole plugins even and all that. So that's what this tab is. So anybody who's written a JConsole plugin, it's a pretty rudimentary tool, they'll still work there, but there's no reason to use it.
And this is part of Eclipse?
No, Visual VM is it's part of the JDK. You can if you type JVisualVM, it's on your machine. You can install the JDK.
Oh, okay. It's just.
But if you want the newer version, because I don't know how old your JDK is, if you want the newer version of Visual VM, because they keep updating it, you can go to the website and download it, and then it's just usually called Visual VM if you use the command line name, or on my Mac I point and click. So I just happened to see that flipping through here that there was an MBean server running, so that I knew that meant that I could attach to it and see those MBeans. There's a bunch of other stuff. Well, so let's go back to our map base. I'm going to roll over to Tyler here in a few minutes, so I'm going to wind down. But we're going to go back here. There's metrics. Let's look at metrics. Okay, well here's my memory, my heap. Got 21 threads, 6,000 some classes.
So is that the result of, who knows those answers? The PM knows that, or who's able to report that? The Spring MVC, or?
It's a good question. So this internal metrics capability is one of those freebies you get from Spring Boot. The metrics endpoint, Spring Boot itself does it. It's probably in one of those auto configures. I don't recall how it's set up, but the metrics endpoint itself and everything pretty much that's under this that we're going to show here is provided by Actuator. So if I remove Actuator and replace it with just a regular Spring Boot starter, my app will still work. I'll still be able to run FreeMarker, right? But I won't get all these other extra endpoints. So Actuator is super valuable because it adds a bunch of other things to see what's going on inside your app. And you may not want to run it in prod, and so I don't recall if there's one singular flag to turn it off in prod, or if you have to do it like component by component. I meant to look into that, and I haven't. But I highly recommend that you always put actuator in your project, because, and I'll show you, there's more to see here. The amount of information it provides to you is really stellar. This metrics thing, though, can be useful for, like, I'm just refreshing. So my instance uptime obviously is going to increase, but you notice what's happening down near the bottom?
Response.
You can see the 200.
You see what's happening there?
Each time your
It's
metric.
counting how many times my metrics endpoint has been hit. So we'll note that beans is 1, right? Okay, so went to beans again. Okay, now beans is 2, right? Simple counter. That could be useful. All right, let's see what else we have here. Well, there's dump. Let's do dump. All right, thread name, RMI, TCP connections. More. Lots of those. Jetty, hash session manager, destroy Java VM, thread. So here's your thread dump.
In a nice JSON format.
In a nice JSON format, so you can process it with your JSON reading tool.
I always do that.
I haven't tried this, but I wonder if they have other, if you do content negotiation, if it'll have another format. I have no idea, but yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Okay, let's look at autoconfig. Okay, so positive matches. Audit, auto configuration, blah, 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 endpoint. I'm going to find one of these that I actually care about. Here's health endpoint, metrics endpoint. Okay, so we just looked at the metrics endpoint. So this says there's an on bean condition. So at conditional on missing bean. So as long as there's not a metrics endpoint bean, then process this metrics endpoint. And this is a fairly common pattern. What it's saying is, I'm going to configure a bean to handle the metrics endpoint, unless I find another bean that already handles the metrics endpoint. And that's the mechanism that they provide to allow you to override it with your own implementation. You may not want to use their health check endpoint. Let's look at the health of our app. We're up. It'll be more interesting, I think, when Tyler, so don't forget to check the health on yours, because I think he has something that automatically adds something to the health
They
endpoint.
can't have any health.
So we'll check.
So if it's not up, will it come up and say,
It will actually say down. So like, for instance, you can override the health check. And so we added, one of the applications we've done for our client, we've added some sort of custom checks to make sure that third-party services are up. And so if it can't talk to any of those things, because they kind of go down fairly frequently, you can hit that endpoint and it will say down and record the fact that like it couldn't hit one of those services.
Right, so we can determine whether the whole app is down
Yeah.
or just some subcomponent, because you may be able to run it in a deteriorated
And
state.
you can kind of set it to do your own sort of test of like what down is and what up is.
okay, that was,
Something's still up. Is it responding?
Yeah,
yeah, that's what I was thinking.
yeah, but let's say your database is down, right? So your app is in a degraded state. So how do you want to indicate that, to your monitoring system, for instance, or to AWS? Let's say you're running in the cloud, right? Do you want your ELB to be sending traffic your way? Maybe you don't, right? That's the load balancer. So, that's up for you to decide whether you have a fallback, behavior in another region or something else that will allow your app to continue to work from your client's perspective, but that this particular instance isn't able to service those requests. So you're going to find another one of these. Conditional on class. So I found servlet, and I found dispatcher servlet. Therefore, I'm going to configure a WebMVC app. So this is really important for figuring out what got turned on and why, or maybe more importantly, what didn't get turned on. Here's our free marker. Remember when we looked at free marker, we said conditional on class? Well, I found FreeMarker template configuration, and I found FreeMarker configuration factory. Therefore, I pass, and I will configure this component. Maybe more importantly, we can scroll down here, and we have negative matches. Well, I kind of wanted to show you Jalokia, but I'm going to run out of time. The reason I wanted to show you Jalokia is I showed you the endbeans. Jalokia is this project that will take those endbeans and turn them into a JSON endpoint, which is your favorite. But you can see your endpoints in JSON, which can allow you to more easily access them programmatically, because the alternative then is RMI, which is a pain to use, right? But if you want to see a value of an endbean, if you want to change your logging level of logback, for instance, you can do that because it's exposed as an endbean for that. So then you can just do a curl command to Jalokia that exposes that endbean through JSON, and you can post to it. It's a REST API. Now you just, with your curl command, just change it into debug logging, right? Which is super powerful. So we're going to run out of time for that, but in order for that to have turned on, I need to have this org Jalokia HTTP agent server. Well, I didn't find that in the class path, so that's a negative match. I'm not going to configure it. Let's see, there's trace, info, config props. That's about it. So trace.
So all those auto configs would have been listed in the negative matches somewhere way at the bottom.
Well, I think they were alphabetical, but yeah, there's a bunch of negatives, a bunch of
I mean,
positives.
at the beginning of the whole spring up, it was said no Elasticsearch, no
No
Solar,
Solar, no JPA, no this, no, yeah. They turned them all off in 3.7 seconds. Trace is kind of fun. So here's trace. This is the last calls that I made. I called metrics. It tells me here what it accepts, cache control stuff, what was in the request headers and the response headers. So I got to 200. That's good. There's timestamps on there. So the new ones might be at the end. I don't know. That was a bunch of metrics. I did mappings more recently, so here's health. Right? Trace bad.
So if we,
Error. Okay, so you go to the bottom here. There's my trace bad. I got a 200 because it sent me the error page. But maybe that's not how I would want it to work, so I'd have to configure that in my controller. All right, there were two more, I think. Info and config props. Info, I don't remember what's supposed to be in info. Props. I must use that one a lot. Oh man, you're gonna be responsible for the environment system property. You can get that.
Yeah.
But that will show what config props
I
does.
think I only have one.
Okay.
This is after all those property beans or configuration beans you put together. This is the actual values.
Well, this is So this is the default. Is this the default properties? I think all of those properties classes that it loaded and injected. So the FreeMarker one is here. Prefix spring.freemarker. There's these properties. Here's our template loader path that we saw. Class path : /templates. Remember that? Here's our suffix .ftl. You were saying, well, what's the FTL syntax or suffix? So we can change that if we want. So this shows you what actually got resolved. So one of the things that Tyler will show you in M&A here is when you have two different environments. Let's say you have a prod environment. How do I override my default properties with my prod properties? That's one of these features that's really super useful. If I want to see, well, what did it actually resolve to? Then I go to my config props endpoint and I can see that that's what it resolved to. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Tyler, unless you have any final questions on the stuff that I've covered here.
And there'll also be time after I'm done.
Yeah, we'll do a full Q&A after. Just anything that I've covered that you wanted me to touch on. Okay.
All right.
Well, then I said it all, because there's no questions.
Alright guys, my name is Tyler Seaton, you had already forgotten, the developer here with Dev9.